Hi, my name is Jeff Hayward, President and CEO of the Heart of Floridian Way. And I want to thank you for tuning into what I feel will be a very important and relevant conversation for our community. In this conversation, we're going behind the headlines with Chip Tatum from the Apartment Association of Greater Orlando to discuss the growing eviction crisis in our community and what is to be expected after the federal eviction moratorium finally expires on December 31st. Before we dive in, let's set some context. We've all witnessed the economic consequences of COVID-19 as it's ravaged our local economy. Businesses have folded, employees have lost their jobs and had their hours cut, and consequently, families are obviously unable to afford their rent and mortgages without a paycheck. Affordable housing has been an issue in Central Florida for a long time, and the ability to stay in housing that families can afford is what's in jeopardy here. And no one is more familiar with that situation than ALICE. ALICE is an acronym standing for Asset Limited, Income Constrained, Employed. Before the pandemic, ALICE made up about 350,000 households in our community. These households were living paycheck to paycheck, in danger of falling off a dangerous financial ledge. These households equate to nearly 50% of the families living here in Central Florida. They weren't able to make their ends meet even before COVID-19 wrecked our economy. And now, we're seeing families struggle even more as the E in ALICE, employed, hangs by a thread. We hear the fear and panic in their voices when they call our 211 Information and Referral Crisis Line. 211 Information Referral Crisis Line is a resource that connects individuals to existing community resources. Anyone can call, text, or chat with a 211 specialist 24 hours a day, 365 days a year to see what resources might be available to help them in their situation. We specifically began tracking calls related to evictions on June 17th. And since then, we've received 14,995 calls for eviction assistance in Orange, Seminole, and Osceola counties. Additionally, we've watched the weekly number of eviction-related calls slowly climb, reaching 742 just this past week. Between all of this, plus the pre-existing economic fragility faced by our ALICE families before the pandemic, it's obvious that stable housing and assistance is vitally needed. And that's why we're here today. However, this is a two-sided story. Of course, on one side are the families who have been financially impacted by this pandemic through no fault of their own. But on the other side are the landlords. They too have been financially impacted by this pandemic, also through no fault of their own. There are no villains in this story, only victims to the financial impacts of this pandemic. The CDC issued a federal eviction moratorium that prevented landlords from evicting tenants impacted by COVID-19 for non-payment. On December 31st, that moratorium expires. To speak with us today about what that means for Central Florida, again, is Chip Tatum, CEO of the Apartment Association of Greater Orlando. Chip's 20-plus year career has ranged from part-time leasing professional to serving as vice president for government affairs for the Florida Apartment Association. Chip's a graduate of Rollins College and in 2018 was inducted into the Florida Apartment Association's Hall of Fame. Chip, we are so happy to have you here and share your valuable perspective on housing and the economic crisis. Glad you could join us.
Thank you so much for having me.
So Chip, we recently spoke with Jay Mobley from Orange County Legal Aid Society and Orange County Clerk of Courts Tiffany Moore Russell. We discussed the eviction process mostly from the tenant's point of view. Can you share the process of the eviction process from the landlord's point of view?
Well, sure. The eviction process, obviously, with 2020 has been complicated at best, right? We've been dealing with moratoria at the state or the federal level now since March. But even before that, we started to see some changes with how sheriffs were not delivering the writ, which is the final action on evictions and things like that. So our owners and our housing providers have been having to figure out how to manage this new normal. And I know we're going to get into this a little bit later, but I would say the short answer is that it's complicated. Now they have to make sure that they're checking more boxes, that that they're not in violation of the federal moratoria with the CDC, that the proper documentation has been filed. And so I think there's just a lot more crossing of T's and dotting of I's.
And Chip, are you seeing any trends in the evictions, numbers going up, how landlords are dealing with it or anything like that?
Sure. Well, I think the good news side of this is that there's been a lot of angst over the anticipation of this. You know, we've heard waves of evictions or tidal waves of evictions, even on occasions. And so the Florida Apartment Association and our organization partnered in late July to actually start asking our members, what does the actual view look like from their perspective? And we asked them to provide us with actual data, like not just speculation, but how many do they anticipate filing and things like that. So since July, the numbers of pending filings or actual filings have been substantially lower than I think what most of our folks would have anticipated based on the economic circumstances and so much, housing fragility with people living already paycheck to paycheck. And then with having the uncertainty of unemployment and whether those benefits were coming in. But we've seen the numbers of pending evictions stay really below 2% of the total unit count through the state of Florida, which is a much lower level than some of the other numbers that we've been hearing. And that's all good news. That's attributable to actions taken by the federal government, to the state government, our local government, and then really, and I know we're going to talk about this in just a minute, the housing industry really sprung into action when the first moratoria started going into place. And they provided their residents with a lot of different options to pay that weren't normally there or weren't or historically available to them in order to mitigate the risk of them having to be evicted. So the short answer is that we're not seeing a tidal wave of evictions. Obviously, any number is concerning. Evictions aren't favorable for the landlord or for the tenant. It's one of those situations where it's the only tool in the toolbox when you have someone that's not paying their rent. So I think they got creative. They've mitigated a lot of evictions. Consistently throughout the time that we've been doing the survey, the number of residents that were on payment plans or payment arrangements or something like that has been significantly higher than the number of residents that were pending eviction. And I think we'll probably talk about this too, but I want to make just a quick important point on that. We've heard from a lot of our members, and we can substantiate it with the data, that a lot of the folks that may be subject to evictions because they haven't tried to work with their landlord. And so for the folks that are listening, if you think you're in a financially precarious situation or your housing's unstable and you have not yet engaged your landlord, make sure that you do that because it's likely that they have a program or something that they can work with you on. What we're concerned about happening is that the folks that are in the pipeline for eviction, if they haven't paid anything over these last several months and they haven't received any sort of financial assistance, they're going to be facing an almost insurmountable debt once they get to that point where they are able to pay or not able to pay it, or where they have to face eviction or pay the debt. And that's one of the things that we're the most concerned about.
That's a great point. We have tried to stress to the folks who are calling 201 and anyone within listening shot, you can't ignore this. Even though there was a moratorium, as you know, there were some conditions on that moratorium. The CDC, you have to file the paperwork for that types of protection. And we've been trying to stress that. So I'm glad you brought that up. We've stressed you cannot just ignore it, that you do, even if you can't pay your rent, you do have some responsibility and some actions you have to take to protect your interests. So I'm glad you brought that up. One eviction is too much. Turning out a family must be a horrible thing to do. And I hate to see any family be removed from their apartment. But at the same time, we anecdotally have heard some incredible stories of kindness and empathy from landlords in trying to work with their tenant. As you know, we were giving financial assistance to families. We pay the landlords directly. We don't give the money to the family. We want to make sure that the rent does get paid, so we do pay the landlords directly. We've had that opportunity to deal one-on-one with some landlords and heard some incredible stories. There's a lot of empathy out there. I'm wondering if you could you must know more than we do about what some of the landlords are trying to do to work with tenants who are having trouble paying their rent. Can you give me some examples of things that landlords have done to go above and beyond and helping their tenants?
Sure, absolutely. And I think you're absolutely right. This is one of the ways where you really seen the human side of this pandemic come out and people trying to work with one another. And we've just seen some really astronomical lifts, in time trying to work with their residents. And that's from operators that are really small scale, maybe just own a handful of units, all the way up to the really large institutional owners and investors. Across the board, we've seen really significant efforts to work with their residents. Some of the more common things that we've heard about is payment flexibility. So maybe they're not able to make their entire payment for that month's rent, but they're able to make most of it or even part of it. And for folks that have demonstrated that effort, there's a contract they can sign that says, okay, we'll accept this low amount of payment and you can pay it off over a series of months instead of having to pay it up all at once or as a balloon sort of option there. We've seen a lot of them reduce the amount of fees or penalties there might be for paying late or for things like that, or even just additional premiums for extending their lease. Like usually shorter term lease agreements have a higher lease price point. A lot of our members have been working with their residents on that as well, either keeping it the same or, working with them however they can. We've seen some really just incredible examples. We've had a couple of owners that forgave rent for either an entire month or 2 months for their entire community, or at least for the community or for the residents that have been impacted. And obviously that's not the norm. Not every company, not every housing provider can afford to do that. But some of the folks that had the means to do it really stepped up and did it. We also heard a lot of them where, some of these programs, as you guys know, you've done an incredible job with Orlando's eviction, or not eviction program, but with the rent relief program. I mean, a huge resource just on that front and a number of others. Especially it could be a little bit complicated to navigate all the requirements associated with those programs from the resident perspective and from the landlord's perspective. And a lot of our landlords have actually sat down with the residents safely at a social distance and actually helped them file the paperwork that they need, or go through the program, or let them use their copy machines to print off whatever they needed, and just really stepping up however they can. Early on in the pandemic, we had one of our housing providers actually rented a whole bunch of laptops and they set them up for their residents to come file for unemployment or file for whatever assistance they had available to them. So we've just seen that across the board. And then we even had one of our smaller owners establish a fund where, just like, City of Orlando and the CARES Act funding was doing in Orange County, they had their own eviction diversion fund, I guess you could call it, where they were providing their residents with rent relief funds out of this, and they collected it from all the different owners that they worked with. So there's just been a lot of those really good news stories, and they're not one-offs. I mean, it seems to be a trend and pretty consistent.
Yeah, we heard very few landlords weren't trying to do something. To your point, from the institutional ones right down to the mom and pop landlords who, probably don't have a lot of resources, a lot of assets that they could make available. But again, we heard some tremendous stories of compassion and empathy, and I think that's what makes this community such a great community to live in and work in. We talked about already, if a tenant's facing problems, challenges paying their rent, the first thing to do is don't ignore it. You have to deal with it. From a landlord's perspective, what should the tenant do if they're having difficulty paying their rent?
Well, again, you just nailed it. The first thing is talk to them and see what's available. More often than not, they're able to work with them in some way. And I would say do that before you get eviction papers. Like when you already know you're going to be in trouble, or even if it's you've made your obligations and the next couple of months might be challenging, go to your manager, your property manager, your housing provider right then and start talking to them, because if they can see demonstrable effort, then it's much more likely they're going to be willing to work with you and tell you what kind of programs are at your disposal. Obviously, whatever I say, the caveat would be it's really up to the individual housing provider, and they all have different programs. So if I give an example, it's entirely possible one may not be doing it, or it may not even be mainstream. But the most important thing is communication. And what we hear more often than not is that the residents that are facing eviction have not made any effort to communicate or wait until it's way too late to do it. Some of our housing providers, they know there's just no way they're going to be able to make the rent or even a partial payment, have been working with folks about being able to break a lease early without as many penalties as there normally would have been, which obviously that still results in them potentially not having housing, but it also takes the risk of having that eviction filing on their record away as well. So again, to harken back to the original point, it's to communicate with their housing provider and pay whatever they possibly can. The worst thing anyone could do is wait until the moratoriums end and then try to, meet whatever mountain of debt or rental back payments that they have. Doing what you can right now really mitigates the risk of having a bigger problem down the road. And that's what most of our housing providers are concerned about, we were talking about the moratorium and stuff. We get the intent of it, but kind of the unintended consequence is creating that squeezing the balloon effect, right? Where, you can manage things when they happen kind of sporadically, but when it's restricted and restricted and restricted, and all of a sudden, there could be a bigger pop at the end of it, and nobody wants to see that.
Right.
So
we characterized the moratorium much like that when it first happened. It was certainly welcome news. It was going to prevent some homelessness, but it was kicking the can down the road. This did not mean, as you know, that the tenants don't have to pay their rent. It's just they're still on the hook. The meter is still running. They are living in the apartment. It's just that the eviction couldn't occur. So I appreciate that realization on your end and pointing it out that it's a balloon or it's kicking the can down the road. Eventually, it's going to come due. So if you mentioned moratorium again, expiring, as we said, December 31st is the CDC's moratorium ends. We don't know if the current administration will extend it. We don't know if the new administration will put in a new one. And I know you don't have a crystal ball, but what do you anticipate will happen next year if a moratorium is not extended or a new one is not in place?
Well, to answer your question, our crystal ball is in the shop too. So we're having some trouble seeing through it.
It's a little cloudy these days, isn't it?
It's real cloudy. We do think that there's a fair chance the moratorium is going to be extended for at least another 30 days. That's the scuttlebutt that we've heard from our national partners. And it seems to be one of the things that might even find out within very short order from Congress if that's happening. But we think it'll happen congressionally, not with the new administration if it does. Again, it's all spitballing for us. It really nothing is done until it's done. But to answer your question, in a lot of ways, we think that the moratoria ending would ultimately be positive for the housing market. And I know that might seem counterintuitive, but what we just talked about was this balloon effect or the kicking the can effect. And the more that we do it, the deeper in debt people get, the less able they're going to be to dig out of it. So I think from the housing provider's perspective, if there's an extension not coupled with significant rent relief out of Congress, then it's going to be exacerbating the problem. And really, there needs to be rent relief one way or the other, because there's people that are struggling, and there's been so many complicated levels of bureaucracy, and that our counties and our local governments and you guys have had to navigate to be able to figure out how to get that money to people expeditiously. And I think the more complicated it is, the more risky it is that either housing providers won't avail themselves of it, or that they just don't even know that it's available or how to go about doing it. And I know you guys deal with that a lot more than we do. So we applaud the United Way and the really the monumental lift that you've done throughout this pandemic and support of the community and especially with Orlando's their program. But we think the moratorium ending, to answer your question, long story longer, ending would probably be positive ultimately, because if not, we're concerned that a protracted moratorium is going to have a whole other unintended consequence where, our landlords, housing providers aren't able to make their commitments. They're not getting, payment forgiveness either from their lenders. And so, and their patience will wear thin eventually as well, as far as the lenders are concerned. And so we risk foreclosure or a whole other level of housing crisis, maybe even akin to what we saw in 2008 with the financial crisis. And that's something nobody wants to see. One of the things that we're also concerned about, even outside of that, and we're already seeing kind of signs of this transpiring, is for, if you own a duplex or a triplex or just a handful of units, the private market, the sales market right now is pretty enticing. And anecdotally, we're hearing a lot about folks that have decided not to rent their property anymore and to sell it on the private market as an owner occupied, asset. Well, that's taking those units, that inventory, out of circulation. And if these moratoria continue, more and more of that's going to happen. And as you know, because you work with so many of them, those smaller owners and operators a lot of times are the naturally occurring affordable housing. They're the ones that are able to work with their residents more one-on-one because they're dealing with 2 or 3 people, not 200 or 300 people in one community. And so that's a real threat to the housing market.
You had mentioned all the programs and the strings attached. That I appreciate you pointing that out, because what we have struggled with at United Way, we know this is government money and it has to be, we have a fiduciary responsibility, but sometimes there were so many strings attached, we had trouble getting landlords to cooperate and participate and even take a second look at them. So you're right, we have this push-pull. We want to make it easier for tenants to access the dollars. We want to make it easier for landlords to participate. But it is government money, and with government money comes a whole host of strings, and it's been finding that balance. So, when you said that, all I could think of was some of the things that my team has said to me and their frustrations of, giving away money is really hard. It's not as easy as it sounds, particularly when it's government money.
Yeah.
Chip, I'm wondering, could you provide some insight on what the National Apartment Association is anticipating or planning? You said you've got some, certainly some voices and ears and eyes in Washington. What are you hearing from them?
Well, one of the things that NAA is advocating the most strongly for is rent relief for both obviously for the residents and the housing providers. And then with as few restrictions in place as possible, not in terms of, being able to use the money or things like that, but there's been a lot of conversation around, median income and tying whatever rent relief comes down to median income. And I think our argument nationally would be, if somebody's been unemployed for 8 months, then they probably need that money as much, whether or not they were at that area median income originally or not.
Right.
And so I think what they would like to see is maybe a better guideline for local governments to follow when the funds do come back down, because we know that it's going to have to be administered at the state and the local level. The federal government just doesn't have the infrastructure to do that nationwide, and it makes more sense to have that managed locally. But they would like to see them provide a better framework for local government to follow with as few strings attached to it as possible, just to get that money out quickly. Because even if a landlord knows or a housing provider knows that they're getting money and they're in the process, if they have to wait 30 or 60 days to get that check, that's 30 or 60 days they may not be able to make their financial obligations, and it makes it a less enticing program. They're also advocating for not these like long extensions of federal moratoriums either, because again, the concern is the impact that's going to have on the housing market. What the outcomes will be on that front, it's anybody's guess. There's a number of other things that they're trying to work with Congress on. There were some things with the payment protection plan or the PPP funds that some housing providers weren't able to access that probably should have been able to, and that complicated those things too. But that's probably not in the appropriate context of this conversation. But the short answer is that our friends at the National Apartment Association have their hands full.
Yes. Yes, they do. There's been a lot to worry about and fear in 2020, and I think we're keeping our fingers crossed and hoping for things to turn in 2021. What is your greatest fear or worry as we come out of 2020? And what's your biggest hope for the future as we go into the new year?
Well, I'll start with the fear and I'll end with the hope, because
That's a
there
good
is the
idea. I want
line.
to end on
Hit
a
on a
good
positive
note.
note. Yeah. So I think we've articulated some of our greatest fears is that if we're facing, first and foremost, government interventions on the housing provider's ability to, remove a resident that's not paying or have other remedies to get paid, then we're facing a potential foreclosure crisis. And I think that that's really one of our greatest fears is what happens when, this whole layer of inventory or housing market inventory comes out of the market. We, as you are well aware, already had a housing crisis before the pandemic, especially on the affordable side. And the less affordable inventory that we have, the greater the risk to our community as a whole. And that's something that housing providers are just as concerned about as local government and our other advocacy partners. We all want to see more inventory and more access to affordable housing. And if this becomes, a more protracted event, then that risks that making that crisis even worse than it was before, even outside of the pandemic. So I think that's our biggest fear. On the hopeful side, it's been really encouraging to see organizations like, the Heart of Florida United Way and, Frank Wells with Housed and all these other groups rallying together to work together to provide these services, figure out what the lay of the land really is. So we've been, fortunate to be able to participate in a lot of those meetings and provide some of the data and the statistics that have been helpful in kind of reprioritizing funding or where to focus energy and efforts. And I think that community collaboration is only going to enhance, and we're going to see more and more positive outcomes from all of us working together. Many hands make light work, right? And I think that we're all in and helping with that lift. I think one of the other encouraging things, and maybe the silver lining down the road that we see, is perhaps some of these folks that were in hospitality jobs or low paying jobs before are availing themselves of some of the new educational opportunities provided through organizations like Valencia College, where they have these short-term certificate programs, or once they complete it, they could potentially be doubling what they would have normally been making before that. We have a program through Valencia for apartment maintenance technicians, and we've seen folks that have gone through that program literally double their income and sometimes better, and then couple that with benefits they never had, housing discounts they didn't have before, and really life-changing changes based on having these new credentials that they can work with. And I think we're going to see more and more people taking advantage of that. And Valencia has just done a tremendous job with Career Source and getting all those funds together and the people through those programs. So I'm hopeful personally that we're going to see a more highly trained workforce and people that aren't as subject to these changes in the economy or these things where the economic fluctuations result in them being able to, make their rent or not. If they're at a higher income and they're able to have some savings, they'll be able to more easily weather some of those storms. So I think we're going to see our economy diversify a little bit more again. We saw that with some of the other economic crises in Central Florida, where we invested in medical city and all these other things, and bringing in technology and reduce our reliance on tourism. And that's not to disparage tourism. I'm only talking about diversity. Obviously, it's going to remain a really, really important part of what we do, but that's where we're hopeful.
Well, that's a lot to be hopeful for. We have the same hopes as you do. We're looking that hopefully people will upskill. To your point about Valencia and Career Source, I happen to sit on Career Source's board, and we've been very happy with what they're doing and looking to get people a certificate in people's hands to help them grow their income. And we do hope there's more than that. We're also thankful. You talked about the collaboration of the different groups coming together. We're thankful for that too. You and I had not had a chance to work together on any issue prior to this, and unfortunately, it took an economic crisis, a pandemic, for us to get to work together. But it's been a pleasure working with the clerk of courts, the chief justices, legal aid, yourself, and so forth, of watching folks come together with, being empathetic to their neighbors, families, and friends. And it's one good thing has come out of that. We're very appreciative of that. So we want to thank you for that.
Well, thank you guys. You did just a tremendous job, and we appreciate it.
Thank you. So Chip, thank you so much for sharing your perspective with us today. I appreciate the work you do, as I said, and we hope that together we can get past this crisis and into 2021 and all of your hopes come true. We share that with you. So thank you very much.
Likewise, thank you.
And to our audience, thank you. Thank you for taking the time to learn and go behind the headlines with me. Heart of Florida United Way is dedicated to bringing important information impacting the well-being of our community directly to you. For more information about the work of Heart of Florida United Way, you can always visit our website, www.hfuw.org. Thank you for spending the time with us. Be well and live united.